Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first series of Legacies Library. Legacies Library was created to really build more awareness about the Secret War and Legacies work, as well as the broader issues impacting Southeast Asia, the broader war legacies issue impacting Southeast Asia. We also want to highlight today our book, The United States Southeast Asia Historical Memory, which features prominent authors such as Noam Chomsky, Elaine Russell, who's an award-winning author, as well as our own founder, Janapa Kamungsa, as well as our guest today, Professor Clinton Fernandes. So before we begin, I just wanted to say every purchase of this book will benefit Legacies of War. So 100% of the proceeds will help us fuel our work in allowing us to continue to do our advocacy effort on the Hill, as well as educational outreach. So I'll pass it off to my executive intern, Anna Pumajantan, to introduce you to our guest today.
Okay, Professor Fernandes is a professor of international and political studies. He has published on the relationship between science, diplomacy and international law, intelligence operations in foreign policy, the political and regulatory implications of new technology and Australia's external relations more generally. He is the author of several publications, including Island off the Coast of Asia, Instruments of Statecraft in Australian Foreign Policy. Thank you, Professor Fernandes, for joining us, and I would like you to give us some remarks.
Oh, thank you very much for the invitation, for the opportunity. The book, the chapter that I've written in the book deals with a period of the 1950s and 1960s. And I'd like to just contextualize that period. Because today, if you think about the non-Western world, the non-United States, Canada, Western Europe, Australia type world, you look at the leaders of that world, and you see people like Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa, General Sisi of Egypt, Erdogan in Turkey, Xi Jinping of China, Narendra Modi of India, Joko Widodo of Indonesia, and these are kind of not especially inspiring figures for everybody around the world. They are status quo type politicians. But the period that the chapter and the book cover is a very, very different period. World news at the time was populated with names like Sukarno of Indonesia, Sihanouk, Cambodia, Nehru of India, Nasser of Egypt, Nkrumah, Lumumba. In fact, Lumumba was assassinated in 1961, just a couple of days ago. It was the anniversary. Chou En-lai of China, Mao Zedong, Ho Chi Minh of Vietnam, Castro, Che Guevara. And so that period, unlike this one, had a dominant narrative of liberation from colonialism, as well as liberation from post-colonial exploitation. And social revolutions of one kind or another were a feature of that period. The politicians, the leaders I've mentioned, were regarded as sort of left-wing, even if they were not, because their countries stood against colonialism, imperialism, which were the forms that capitalism presented itself most directly in the third world or the global south, right? And some of these politicians also stood very clearly for social transformation. So that's the period that I'm writing about, and we have to contextualize that. The women's movement had not yet happened. The civil rights struggle was underway, but it was still in the 50s. The Birmingham thing was in the 60s. And so there was no protest against the Vietnam War or anything like that. So the three big movements in the United States, women's liberation, civil rights, and the movement against the Vietnam War, had not yet taken hold. I mean, they were fringe movements. There were courageous activists doing it, but it was a small thing. Whereas after that period, it became very big. But this chapter and the book more generally is set in the 50s and 60s, which was a very different period. And they had those leaders had the ability to inspire people around the world in the name of Afro-Asian solidarity. There was a talk of a tricontinental uh, solidarity in which Latin America, Africa, and Asia, formerly dominated countries, could somehow come together. And that's the period and the context, the imagery of the period. So this chapter is set in Indonesia in the 1950s and 1960s, where you have someone like Sukarno, who is a major figure, not just in Indonesia, but in the non-Western world more generally. There was an attempt by Sukarno, by Nasser of Egypt, by Nehru of India, by Nkrumah and other leaders in Africa, to form a non-aligned movement, which would not be either part of the United States capitalist bloc or the USSR-dominated communist bloc. And so those non-aligned countries also happen to be places where all the resources were: oil, rubber. Rubber was extremely important, not just in Malaya, which is now Malaysia, or Vietnam or Indochina, but for the West, because the automobile industry was ramping up. The post-war boom was happening, and in order to have tires, you needed to have rubber. And I mean, there were attempts to develop synthetic rubber. As canned goods began to proliferate, even during the Second World War and after, tin from Malaya and Vietnam and other parts of Indochina were extremely important. And so who would control those resources? Would they be used in the interests of the peoples of those countries, or would they be made subject to what the United States wanted? That's the defining factor. Now, in this sense, a communist and a communist threat is not just a nation or a leader who belongs to a communist party or is somehow controlled by the Soviet Union, but anyone who doesn't agree to subordinate their economy to the United States or Britain or France would be regarded as a communist. And that, in fact, is what US Secretary of State Dean Acheson said, that all those nationalists are communists. All nationalists are commies. That's his words. And so the question of whether somebody was in the Communist Party or not, in a way, was immaterial to the West, because really what mattered was, will you allow your economy, your resources, your oil, your rubber, your rice, your wheat, your tin, would you allow that to be used by our corporations in our interests? Or are you going to insist on it being used in your interests? Sukarno of Indonesia was explicitly committed to using his country's resources in their own interests, and that's why he had to be destroyed. I guess that is probably the best way to finish my opening remarks.
Wow, thank you so much. That was really informative. So going on to our first question, how did you become interested in the US and Australia's intervention in the political affairs of Indonesia in the 50s and 60s?
Well, I'm focusing on Australia's external relations more generally.
Okay.
I examine Australia's relations with Indonesia, with what is today Timor-Leste, East Timor, parts of the Southwest Pacific, relations with the other great powers. And so Indonesia is just a part of that. But Indonesia is a very, very important country for Australia. I mean, it's right on the other side of the Arafura Sea, and it's extremely important in its own right. So that's why I guess I paid a special attention to our relationship with Indonesia.
No, I completely hear you. Two things that you mentioned earlier, like, which I really appreciate, is that you're setting the context for our viewers tuning in today, because that's a very different time, right? Like, there are some folks who are watching this that were not, even thought of yet in the 50s and 60s. But one thing that I did also want to highlight, because I think it's really, really important that you mentioned, is these natural resources. oil, rubber, tin, that's fueling what's happening in that period's economy right now. So important to really know, what was happening during this time in the superpowers, U.S., Britain, and France. So thank you for that. So, in the beginning of your chapter, Australia's role in Indonesia started with the best of intentions, right? Like, Australia even referred the matter of Indonesia's desires to be rid of Dutch rule and gain independence. Australia actually took this cause to the UN on behalf of Indonesia. And according to the chapter, Australia's stance really evolved due to this rise of the Communist Party. Is that a really valid fear, and why? Or were there other motives such as what you mentioned, oil, rubber, tin?
Sure. Yeah, the Republican movement in Indonesia was a broad front. There were people who were nationalists, there were people who were pro-communist, there were people who were basically just peasants, who, I mean, that's the majority of Indonesians, in fact. And so the Dutch rule was regarded by Australia's wartime leaders as illegitimate. The people who had led Australia during the Second World War were from the Labour Party, and they were certainly not a revolutionary party or an anti-imperialist party, but they were able to think over the long term as to what the future looks like. And the last thing they wanted was um, an insurgency and a counterinsurgency and guerrilla war in Indonesia, in which the Indonesians are fighting against the Dutch, and then the left Republican forces and the communist forces become stronger. It was basically a sense that the Dutch period was coming to an end. It had lost its right to rule, its legitimacy, but they were also extremely aware that a number of tens of thousands of Australian troops had served in Southeast Asia. And these were working class people in the Second World War. They had gained a respect for and a kind of an affinity to the Indonesian people. And they were also unwilling to accept the return of Dutch colonialism. In fact, it was Australian trade unions led by unions in the Communist Party of Australia, but much broader than that. There were church groups and lots of other people that called for a blockade of Dutch logistics going back to Indonesia. There were ships that were supposed to be heading back to Indonesia, carrying Dutch troops and equipment and reinforcements and ammunition. And the Australian trade unions on the waterfront blocked that. And so the government realized, look, this is just too difficult. It's best we finish this. Now, what changed, of course, was that the Labour government changed and a new government came in. And that coincided with a different approach by the United States itself. That, okay, now that you've got independence, what kind of independence should there be? The West and Australia as well were willing to accept political independence, that you can now have your own leaders, but not economic independence. Now, they wanted to make sure that foreign corporations, which had previously controlled the Indonesian economy under colonialism, would continue to do so. And that's what actually happened in Indonesia. There were foreign corporations like Shell, Caltex, Stanvac. They controlled the oil industry. There were Dutch and British interests and nationalist Chinese interests controlling the banks. The Indonesia is an archipelago, and so inter-island shipping was controlled by Dutch interests. And so the West was willing to accept political independence, provided the economic control did not change. Now, once Sukarno began to talk about we need to control our own economy, that's when he became an enemy.
Yeah, thank you for that. Our next question is, would history be different if the US and Australia never tried to interfere with Indonesia and encourage rebellion in the islands of Sumatra and Sulawesi?
Yes, look, I don't want to get too much down the road into an alternative history, like a what if, but you're right. I mean, it's a very, very good question. firstly, Indonesia itself would have had a better democracy and a less vicious military.
Mm.
Because what happens when a country comes under attack is that any country, whether that's Iran today or North Korea or any country, the security services and the military become empowered, and they kind of squash civil society. There are civil liberties that are removed. Freedom of the press is removed. The military starts ramping up, defensive but militaristic rhetoric, and that's exactly what happened in Indonesia.
Mm.
It was basically the end of standard democracy in Indonesia after the United States and Australia encouraged the Outer Islands Rebellion, because the military was empowered. It suddenly meant that they were the ones that were the saviors of the nation, and they were able to put in place certain policies, but also gain greater influence in cabinet. So that's the first thing that would have happened. It would have been a less militarized Indonesia, but a less militarized Southeast Asia. That's the key thing.
I think that's you're probably right on in that, and you're right. You know, we can talk all day about all the different theories of if this had not happened, this would have happened. The same thing goes with like Laos,
Mhm.
Cambodia, and Vietnam. But I wanted to bring back to one of the things that you mentioned. You know, when we're talking about this intervention, right, like by Australia and the U.S., you mentioned that the the stance really was you can have your own leader, but no economic independence, no economic freedom, right? I wanted to just kind of ask you to unpack that a little bit more. Like, by you can have your own leader, would you say it's true that it could only be the leader that we back, like meaning the Americans back or Australians back? Because there's been talks of like the person that's put into power is usually deemed as the puppet ruler.
Well, it's they prefer a leader that they install, but it's really the policy. So they would like a leader who will protect freedom and stability of a particular kind. They want economic freedom of foreign businesses to invest, to repatriate profits. So the profits shouldn't stay with the people, but should be taken back home to, say, London or Paris or New York or DC or places like that. And they want investment stability, which means a stable climate for business operations. In other words, we don't want any union power. We
Mm-hmm.
don't want any strikes or anything like that. And we want access to your human and material resources. And that, in fact, is what happened right next door in Malaysia. It's very interesting to contrast why Indonesia was attacked and Malaysia, once they destroyed the Malaysian Communist Party. Why Malaysia was fine, because their prime minister was an aristocrat. He was a guy who had gone to Cambridge to study law, had failed that. He loved racehorses. His cabinet was Malay aristocrats and some business leaders in China. Um, and for him, he was happy being the prime minister of Malaysia, but it did not threaten Britain's economic interests in the country. Uh,
Mm.
Most directors in their top companies, top 100 companies, were non-Malaysian. The British corporations controlled a dominant part of the Malaysian economy. So yes, they were politically independent, but economically they had very little policy space to maneuver to solve their own country's problems. Now, Indonesia was different because they wanted economic independence as well. They wanted more policy space. And
Right.
so the big difference between political and economic independence is the extent of policy space you can get if you're in the global south or a third world country. And the role of Western foreign policy at the time, and to a certain extent even today, but using different means, is to reduce your policy space. Before in uh, the book and the chapter that we're talking about, they use military force to reduce policy space. Today they use debt. They
Mm.
use,
Mhm.
debt and structural adjustment programs and austerity, through the IMF and the World Bank to reduce a country's policy space. But the underlying motive is the same.
Right, right. No, you bring up great points, and it's really such a great reminder. As we look in our work, like one of the things that we studied in this book, as well as at War with Asia by Noam Chomsky, is just
Mm.
this. it sort of alludes to how when you look at Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, you know, it's in the same region, but the neighbor Thailand was not touched, right? Like Thailand was not bombed. But I think there's a lot of similarities that we can draw from Indonesia and Malaysia.
Yes. Yes, I mean if I could just add here, I mean the Thailand question is extremely relevant here because in Thailand you've got generals who establish a police state and then they enrich themselves. You know, the army chief took everything from the national lottery. The police chief took the funds from the opium trade, but the Thai dictatorship was willing to serve the West. It was willing to open its economy to the West, to Western interests, and willing to allow its soil and its military personnel to suppress Southeast Asian nationalism. So, for example, the Ubon Air Base in Thailand was where jets would take off and then go across and then bomb Vietnam and then fly back to, say, the Philippines, and the Philippines would do the same thing. And so there was a grid in which a bombing grid over Vietnam using these Southeast Asian countries like Thailand and the Philippines. And so there was no reason to invade them because they were already giving you what they wanted, namely the ability to crush a national revolution in Vietnam, or in my case, in my chapter's case, in Indonesia.
Yeah, it's like who can you put who basically who would serve the interest of having an air base to fly out from, right? Like
Yes.
um,
And we see that today as well, right? But the talk of a rules-based international order. And everyone's wondering, well, what is a rules-based international order? What are these rules? And the reason is there is a word that is extremely difficult to pronounce in English. It's called empire. You can't say that. And so let's say rules-based international order, and let's sort of scratch our heads and write long articles about what's a rules-based international order. Is China following it? Is Venezuela doing it? Is the United States doing it? Because we can't pronounce the word EMPIRE.
Yeah, they certainly used the word back in the day, right? Roman empires, Byzantine, all that.
Yeah, and it's very interesting because, see, the Roman Empire had certain defining characteristics. The Roman conception of empire explicitly was not about the borders, but about political control and the control of effective sovereignty of other lands. So Julius Caesar himself, he writes The Conquest of Gaul. He says the most important thing isn't the borders of the empire, but where we actually exert political sovereignty. And so for the United States, it's not an empire in the sense that it has colonies, although one can say something about Puerto Rico. But generally speaking, it's where it exerts it controls the political sovereignty of other countries. That's really what an empire means. There are specific versions of empire which involve colonies, but for the most part, empire doesn't need colonies as long as you can deny political sovereignty to somebody else.
Banks, money, right?
Yes.
Economic independence.
Yes.
I have one last question before I ask my actual question.
Okay.
Kind of back off to Anna. One of the most intriguing thing in your chapter for me personally was that for Indonesia, the Communist Party really gained a lot of power and traction, not because of this fire to rebel against colonialism, right? But it was more about just giving the people the right to earn a living, right? Like economic stability, and making a decent wage in order to provide for their families. That
Yep.
to me was really striking because, for Laos is what we know best is, I really feel like with Laos, it was more of just people standing up to aggression, right?
Yes.
And like, what do you think is like, why do you think this is so different for Indonesia? Weren't the people also upset, of Dutch rule?
I mean, if you stand up for economic independence, you'll be regarded as communist regardless. Okay, I mean, because objectively, it has the same consequence because you're denying your country's resources to the West, and you want to use it for yourself. And so, for the Indonesian Communist Party, they were not a revolutionary party. The Indonesian Communist Party were trying to advance the interests of the poor within the existing system. They were not a revolutionary party. But it didn't matter. They had to be destroyed because the resources of Indonesia, it's located on the equator. It's got certain types of crops. It's got oil, and of course rubber. And so those things had to be used for the benefit of the West rather than Indonesia. So the Communist Party had to be destroyed for that reason. What they were actually trying to do was force landlords to obey Indonesian law. The Indonesian government had passed laws to give a certain amount of land to people who worked on the land. I mean, there were people who were landlords who owned lots of land, and then there were utterly, uh, you know, destitute farmers who would work on the land but didn't own anything. And so the Indonesian government had passed laws saying, okay, if you've been sitting on this land for years and years and years, well, that little plot of land is yours now, right? And so the landlords were refusing to comply. So the Indonesian Communist Party was not revolutionary. It was trying to get the landlords to obey Indonesian law. And this resulted in very violent responses by landlords and their own thugs and the security forces who were involved with them. They were taking up the cause of plantation workers in industrial workers, and they supported Hindus against East Javanese Orthodox Muslims, but they also opposed Hindu priestly authority in Bali. And so this is not communist kind of ideology. It's really an attempt to resolve and to solve to advance the interests of the Indonesian peasantry within the existing system. But that was precisely what the problem was, that they had to be destroyed for that reason.
Yeah, no, you make a really good case, and thank you for that answer. Now, you know, Anna's last question was just regarding the rebellions. In addition to like the lives lost, can you describe the other destruction that the island faced during the rebellion period?
Oh, well, the outer islands are where there were oil terminals, and these are quite important if you're trying to earn foreign currency. I just want to once again set the scene here. When Indonesia became independent, it had been a Dutch colony called the Netherlands East Indies. But when it became independent, it was forced to take over the colonial government's debt of about 4 billion guilders, of which more than 1 billion guilders was external debt and had to be repaid in foreign currency. And so Indonesia needed its own oil industry, its own oil plantation, its own oil refineries to make all these things happen. When you have the Outer Islands Rebellion and warfare, it reduces the ability of the central government to control its own resources. So that ramps up the level of tension inside the society. It increases the level of human misery inside the society. And those were the intended consequences of the Outer Islands Rebellion, at least from the United States perspective. They wanted to make the country unlivable in order to eliminate popular support for Indonesia's president. The other aspect of the Outer Islands Rebellion are the ones that I've just discussed a few minutes ago, which is it eliminates or it reduces civil society's power and empowers the military. Once you militarize something, whether that's in Iran or China or anywhere else in the world, it doesn't matter if the thing isn't going to work, in foreign pressure, because in a sense it does work by reducing the amount of democratic space and increasing the intelligence budget, the police budget, the prison budget, the military budget, and all of those things in a poor country means fewer subsidies to farmers for their crops and fertilizers, fewer less access to schools and health and hospitals, education, things like that. So those are major effects that it had. It's more than a simple rebellion in the outer islands. It's a very good question you asked.
Right. And I just had a follow-up question to that. So you mentioned like the tremendous debt, that Indonesia would have to pay. This may sound silly, but since it was debt that were incurred by the Dutch, why did Indonesia still have to pay, and who enforced that?
It was one of the conditions for the Dutch leaving. That they were required to take over. If you want to take over the Dutch colony, you take over the entire colony, including everything to do with it.
Mhm.
So we're not going to bother paying this off. It was part of the terms of the Dutch withdrawal. And these are the things that were negotiated at the United Nations um, during the debates as to whether and how the Dutch should leave. I mean, there were similar things occurring in Malaya with Britain, in Indochina, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, with France, because it had very similar things. I mean, and there's no accident, right? They're on the same part of the equator. They're on the similar geographical distribution, and so the soil is the same, the climate's the same, and Indo-Chinese rubber and tin were vital for the reconstruction of France's economy after the Second World War. And so that's why Indochina had to be attacked, because otherwise it would have eliminated France's ability to reconstruct itself as one of the engines of post-war capitalism. And Indonesia had the same thing. They were just forced to take over that debt. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been enough support among the United States and so on to allow the Dutch to leave.
Wow, everything is just so connected. So going on, uh, could you please help the viewers understand like the extent of Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War and its impact in Southeast Asia as a whole, and if there is any is there like Australia's responsibility to remedy these negatives effect today?
Sure. I mean, the Vietnam situation was the Australian experience in Vietnam was different to the United States experience in Vietnam. Um, there is because of the power of mass media, people even in Australia often assume that the Australian forces behaved in the way normally associated with the United States. Massive air campaigns and Agent Orange and uh, war crimes, mass shootings, things like that. But really, it has to be said that the Australian experience of Vietnam was quite different. The reason Australia went to Vietnam uh, is not too different to the reason it went to the Iraq War in 2003. It was an attempt to join a larger countries, an imperial country's strategy, and to fit into it, to show its relevance, and also to try and keep the United States in Southeast Asia. So what did Australia actually do? Well, they sent, there was a zone, an area of operations, and a base called Vung Tau. And that's basically where the Australian forces were. The area that they were in is different to other parts of South Vietnam where the fighting was, because it happened to be the place where a number of Catholics from the north went to after the 1954 Geneva Accords. And many of them happened to settle in the place that eventually became the Australian area of operations. And so the um, the resistance that the Australian forces encountered was much less than elsewhere. But Australia has, in fact, uh, did participate in the Malayan conflict and maintained a base in Malaya for decades after that. And Australia is involved in Iraq, in the Gulf region by ship, in the United Arab Emirates and elsewhere. But it's basically what you might call a sub-imperial power. Australia was a sub-imperial power when the British Empire was there, and it remains a sub-imperial power with the United States imperium. I mean, currently the United States sits at the center of an hierarchically structured imperial system with it on top, and lesser imperial powers like Britain and France. But then you've got sub-imperial powers, which look a lot like third world countries, because Australia, its major exports are beef and wheat and coal and iron ore, what you'd expect from a third world country. But it's not a third world country, because it's not an exploited colony, but rather a junior partner of the imperial power, first Britain and now the United States.
Wow. You've given us so much information that we were not familiar with, right? Like, so I did want to ask just a little bit more. So Australia was there and a part of the Vietnam War, right? But
Mhm.
where was the troop station? Was it just in Thailand? Was it just Air Force, or were there any troops on the ground?
Oh, it was mainly the Royal Australian Air Force sent a jet fighter squadron to Thailand in order to fight in Vietnam. Okay, there were Australian forces who fought alongside Thai volunteers, uh, but the main action that Australia performed in that respect with Thailand was to train the Royal Thai Armed Forces personnel, um, both education and training. The um, police in Thailand, for example, were given counterintelligence and intelligence training, anti-subversive technique training in Australia. There was something called the Colombo Plan, which was brought in by one of Australia's most important foreign affairs ministers, and it was a plan of foreign aid to keep these anti-communist regimes in power. And as part of the Colombo Plan, people think of it as a humanitarian program. It was not. It's an instrument of anti-communist statecraft. It was counter-revolutionary, and that plan funded, that plan's budget funded the training of the Thai police, and so it's that level of involvement. The actual involvement that Australia had in terms of fighting was much less, simply because it's a smaller country, has a smaller military. Uh, just so you understand, in Iraq in 2003, the Iraq invasion, the United States wasn't defeated on the battlefield, but it lost the war in the sense that it failed to achieve its objectives, a permanent base in Iraq, right? Australia won that war. Australia won the Iraq war. You know why? Because Australia's aim was to show its relevance to the United States. Australia achieved its war ambition, even if the United States did not. That's how one should understand the Australian involvement in Vietnam.
Mm. Yeah, no, I completely understand the dynamic, and I just like how honest like you talked about it, right? Because it's it especially in today's like movement, right? We always ask like, what is the responsibility of countries that were involved in intervention? What is the responsibility of countries that were involved in colonizing or aggression in general, right? But this is one where I just really feel like you know, we talked about this a lot, where the Vietnam War era is what our organization talks about, but we not talk about the Vietnam War, or as they call it in Vietnam, the American War, um, without talking about Laos, Cambodia, Thailand. Um, to a certain extent, like we pull in China, Russia, and all the other superpowers that were backing opposing forces, but Australia was one that we just don't really hear about, right?
Yes.
So,
Some years ago, the Australian Foreign Minister, Bob Carr, provided some funds to help with the unexploded ordnance, unexploded bombs in Laos. Um, Very little, unfortunately, is known about in the public mind about Laos. But in fact, it was the most severe air campaign in history at that point. Um, and the reasons why so many bombs were dropped, it's shocking once you realize that they just had to get rid of all those bombs. But I don't want to get into that, because I know other people have talked about that, and the best work on this exposing it was by a gentleman called Fred Branfman, who is now
my favorite
deceased. But
at Legacies. Yeah,
right,
absolutely.
right. I mean, he corresponded with me before he died. We talked a few times, but he really did the most important early work on Lao. And I know that Professor Chomsky visited Lao for a few days. That visit is not very well known to the general public, but it has gone down as a legendary kind of visit among activists, for how he went there and worked like a maniac, it has to be said. Um, he was given a book by Branfman in the evening, about 500 pages. And Fred told me this, and the next day they had to go and see some guy in the United States consulate or the embassy, or some official. And that gentleman was providing some details and some figures. And Noam says, well, actually, on page such and such of this book, we have a different figure. It was incredible. People forget one thing, they remember Noam's memory, but what they forget is the active will needed to stay up all night and read that book.
Mhm.
Anybody can have a memory. Well, anybody cannot, but some people have extraordinary memories. But to have the will and the commitment to do that shows why he is so important. And it's thanks to people like Fred Brantman and Chomsky and others that the Lao thing has even gotten out to the extent that it has.
You're so right. About Professor Chomsky, and I'll also add too. In our last interview with him, he actually talked about his riding on a bike with Fred Brantman. But one of the sites of the refugees that were fleeing the countryside after the bombing in Laos, there were 3 visitors to that site along with Fred Brantman, and Professor Chomsky was the only one that actually really wept. Like, he felt for the people. So you're so right. Extra thankful to the people who had the will as well as the passion to stand up and bring this issue of Laos to light.
Yeah.
On our end, we still feel like there's not enough said. There's still people
No,
that are not educated about this, right?
no.
And about other regions as well. Now, I sort of want to bring us back to this other question that we had. You know, uh, in a way, I just feel like I don't think any how would you say forms of government. There are no perfect forms of government, right? But in your opinion, like, how has the Western fear of communism like shaped the world that we live in today? It's a lot of the fear propaganda that are placed out there, or is communism really really bad as many people say?
Uh, I mean, nobody controls the word communism, and so I don't. I mean, there are regimes and governments and places that describe themselves as communist, and others that also do describe themselves as communists, and they don't look at all like each other. So nobody owns the term communist. But the critical factor, and this is from the United States' own planning documents, is the critical factor is, are these countries willing to make their economies available to us in the manner that we need them?
Mm.
If so, then they are fine. If not, then they are communist. I mean, the real threat is that the resources, which are not located for the most part in Western Europe or North America, those resources that are located elsewhere must be used for the benefit of Western corporations. If you're okay with that, it doesn't matter what your human rights record is, you're fine. If you're not okay with that, you'll be called a communist or a subversive or a terrorist or some other aspect, and somebody who's undermining the rules-based international order. That's the key thing. I mean, there are many countries that call themselves communist. But they also call themselves democracies. I mean, the Soviet Union called itself a communist, democratic, people's democratic place. Now, so I mean, so does North Korea, for example, a People's Republic, Democratic Republic, and so on. The Western intellectual system, the ideological system, the culture laughs at the idea that they are democracies. And rightly so, because they're not democracies. I mean, North Korea is kind of an Asian monarchy of some sort that's trying to replicate itself through a family. So the Western intellectual system will laugh at the idea that the democracies, but they say, yes, they are socialist, they are communist. And the reason for that is they wanted to associate communism or socialism with those repressive regimes in order to reduce the political attractiveness and sometimes even the moral force that communism or socialism possessed in the early part of the 20th century. So that's the whole point of the term communist. They call themselves communist and democratic. They said, no, you're not democratic, but you are communist. And so everyone thinks, well, communism means gulags. and so on. The real issue is, is there self-determination or is there not? Are the resources of the region to be used and to be placed under the control of the people of the region? Or are those people perpetually consigned to simply be a source of raw materials? The big question at the time was what path to development. I mean, today that's gone because the question is, emerging markets and good governance, and how can we find, how can we get into the G20? How can we get developed through capitalism, things like that. And these are completely impossible because any kind of capitalist system, whether it's state capitalist or any other kind of system, requires some areas where the resources are coming from and other areas where they're being transformed into goods. And that kind of high level production must remain in the Western countries. And if there's a threat to that, then those threatening it are called communist.
You're right. There's definitely a tension between the global North and South, and basically in the globalization.
Yeah, I mean, Australia was born on the winning side of a global confrontation between the West and the rest, the North versus the South, liberal democracies versus the others, imperialists versus the colonized peoples, whatever you want to call it, the first world, the third world. Australia was born on the winning side. And the organizing principle of Australia's foreign policy is to remain on the winning side. And that's why Australia will fight with the United States alongside the United States in Indonesia, Vietnam, Iraq, anywhere else. But just back to what was said earlier by both of you about the importance of bringing it to the attention of the United States population. That's critical. The biggest obstacle to imperial force is the conscience and the awareness of the populations of those countries, because those people are not monsters. If provided with the information, they would be shocked. And Noam Chomsky's entire political project in this respect, towards Vietnam, is simply to bring awareness to the American public of what their government's doing in their name. He says in a speech in Manufacturing Consent that the people struggling for self-determination in the global South and the third world, and here I'll quote, rely for their survival on a very slim margin of dissidence and turbulence in the imperial countries. And how large that margin is up to us. So I think what you guys are doing with Legacies of War is trying to increase the margin of dissidence and turbulence and awareness in the imperial countries in order to get more breathing space to people in the global South.
Yep. So well said. I do think that it's there has to be a voice for the voiceless, right? And appreciate you saying that's exactly what Legacies is, and we strive for that, but we can't do it alone. Like, not a
No.
small, there has to be so many more people really just helping to speak up. And I always like, I have this fear, of succession, because we're such a small niche group. There's like let's say the people who's impacted the most is the Laotian population, right? Like, most of the people who are in the US, the 350,000 or so people that are here, many of them, like my parents' generation, for example, they fled Laos, right? For various different reasons. But in addition to that, it's not just the US that these refugees and immigrants fled to. There are some in Australia, right? There's a lot in France. But people who know the history know why these different countries accepted these refugees and immigrants. But I think, the most important thing here is to really speak to the broader public, and especially Americans, because as you say, this is what the government's doing in their name. Many Americans were shocked to learn, and many Americans are still shocked to learn. But, I do wonder, and Anna's going to go into this soon, like, what does it have to take in order for the people to take action, right? Like, it's not just about knowing and spreading the word, but there has to be action. Otherwise, like, ideas and thoughts don't make a difference. It's irrelevant without action.
Yeah. Oh, the knowledge, but there isn't enough knowledge yet. I mean, there's more than one way of doing that. Some of it is a book, but reading a book by yourself is an act of will.
Mm,
There has to be a reading group that can do it. Also, culture can be a terrain of solidarity. The film world, which would allow the lives of people in the global south to be brought to the attention of people in the west. That could be a realm of solidarity and activism and resistance. It's not just one shouldn't think only as in the like us who can write books and sustained arguments, but rather how does one do it through culture, through songs, through music. But one has to be reasonably optimistic. I mean, this decade is a very important decade. It's just begun. I mean, we've had a pandemic, we've had a big transition in the United States presidential system, but we're also seeing the awakenings
mhm,
of more people like us. I mean, the fact is, one of the nicest things about receiving an invitation from you was that I don't know you. And if I'm talking to people I already know, then I realize that well, it's getting that audience, but nobody else. On the other
mhm,
hand, if we are talking, if we are only just meeting now and talking, then it expands our audience, mine to yours and yours to mine,
mhm,
and that's the way one does it. Ultimately, the most important factor, uh, the two factors I would say, is you know endurance,
mhm,
to keep going, to fight the fights that need fighting, not just the fights you think you can win. So endurance. And the second thing is flexible tactics. You just have to be able to use different things. You can take your message to social gatherings, community gatherings, without trying to dominate them because they'll just kick you out. But uh, you know but just things like that, like educating people about food. When you have Laotian food,
mhm,
you can talk about that, where it comes from and why it's important. It can be a terrain of politics if it's done properly. So endurance is the most important thing, just to keep going. The example of 92-year-old Noam Chomsky is there, but also just flexible tactics. Just pick different ways you can do it. It doesn't always have to be it doesn't have to be just the way we're doing it. I mean, Zoom is a great way, of course, but there are other things. There are things like uh, songs, food, dress, music, movies. There's a whole bunch of things that can be done. Exhibitions.
mhm.
Those are really great suggestions. So our last question is, if someone were to read this book, what would you consider to be the key idea that you would get out of this book or your chapter?
The key thing is uh, that the aim of uh, imperial policy is to ensure that the resources of a region are not enjoyed by the people of those regions, but to elite groups in the West. That uh, it is not the Vietnam War, or the war against Indonesia is not a war between the United States and Indonesia, or the United States and Vietnam, but rather it is a conflict between those who believe in freedom and liberation and those who do not, in both countries. So it's not just one versus the other, but it's people in both countries that believe in freedom and liberation versus those who do not, and usually that means the elite.
Right. No, thank you so much for this very, very fruitful conversation today. We enjoy so much talking to you and
Oh, it's mutual.
your time. Yes. And also your contribution to the United States Southeast Asian historical memory, which for our viewers today, please click on the link below, share your comments, share this interview. And please, make a purchase of this book and learn more. Chapter 7 is by Professor Clinton Fernandes, The Indonesian Domino. You'll enjoy it. You'll learn more about a lot of the things that we discuss, unpack more, and start a conversation. And you heard it here. Professor Fernandez has said, keep going. Endurance is the key to make change, and don't just fight the battle that you think you can win. Just keep fighting the battle that you care about. So thank you so much again. We love having you. As we say in Legacies, Kapjai.
갑자기.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity, and keep up the work.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Right, Anna, you could